born in Toronto.
Oh, okay, there you go. There. Let me tell you about this. I sent you some books or DVDs that I found incredibly interesting and easy to get, and many of these items are available through the Sarasota library system. So you don't even have to purchase them if you don't want to. But just to tell you, fill you in, everyone knows, I'm guessing, that books have an ISBN number, and sometimes they have two ISBN numbers depending on where they're published. Some are for European, I think. So I went ahead and gave you both of them because I'm not sure which one is the American one. So last time we talked about how important it was for the state of Israel to get itself together with art and craft and a means of expressing themselves and a way for them to create an economy. So craft obviously is an important way to create an economy, and more and all of these things work together in creating an identity. So you have to have a clear connection to these things. They represent who you are, they tell you what's expected of you, art tells you what's expected of you, art creates order in the world, it helps you think in that it orders your thinking even according to the way novels are written, according to the way various ways that the arts create an individual is done through the arts. Politics is defined through the arts, and the arts are extremely important in representing to a person what is expected of them in their culture, how they can evolve as a human being, how they can become more cultured, how they can serve their civilization. So, we talked about the influences that came into this thinking during the time that the first Zionist organization came together, 1890-something. That's when Theodor Herzl had this important meeting in Basel, Switzerland. That was the first meeting of the Zionists. And Martin Buber, who was an extremely important philosopher in general. He's known for the book called I and Thou, which is extremely complicated, goes way beyond my capacity to understand, but I'm sure it's important. Anyway, one of the great contributions that he made at that moment, because at the time that that first Zionist organization congregation got together, they decided what the flag of Israel was going to look like. So what did they choose as their flag? The Star of David and a prayer shawl. A prayer shawl from the synagogues. That's what the Israeli flag is. It's a prayer shawl, white with blue stripes. And then they chose the shield of the Star of David, because anyone that went to battle in the ancient world had a shield. And you had a shield that represented which country you were fighting for. And so David's shield had the Star of David, what came to be known as the Star of David. So you see how these symbols, play such an important role in a person's identity. Those two symbols, putting them together, had a powerful impact on people. If you have the kind of flag that brings you to your knees, you will be willing to die for your country. This is very important because we know war never goes out of style. So that was determined at that Congress. The other thing that was determined around that time is which language the Jewish world was going to adopt. And they decided by a vote of 51 to 49. 51 was Hebrew, 49 was German. They were going to adopt German as the language of Israel because that was the language that had the most prominent authors at the time. They were going to be a first world nation from the get-go. And the way you get to be a first world nation is to have intellectuals and scientists and engineers. That's how you become a first world nation. So they chose Hebrew, which had a problem because no one had written a modern Hebrew yet. Hebrew was the language of 2,000 years ago, before Renaissance, before the Industrial Revolutions, before all these things that happened, that you need new and represent ideas very clearly. You're using an ancient language that has to be modified and elevated to the present day. This is an enormous linguistic undertaking. And the man that did that was a gifted scholar by the name of something something, but he changed his name to the son of Judah, the son of Judea, Ben Yehuda, Eliezer Ben Yehuda. The word Eli, even the name Eli, has in it God. Right? So he is the son of God. The name is connected to God, the first name, and the son of Judea. Well, he then went about, dedicated something like 37 years of his life to writing the modern Jewish dictionary. And his little boy was the first child in Israel, 4 or 5 years old, that was only spoken Hebrew to. Spoken only Hebrew. And then so modern Hebrew became the international, well, the language of the country. You have to have these incredible tools, and you have to have those people that, you know, create these incredible tools for a nation to move forward. But of course, they're very smart in Israel because they know the lingua franca, one of the important lingua francas of the world, is English, in particular American English today. So everyone practically in Israel is bilingual. What we have then in this list is that association of the ideas that Buber brought to the consciousness of those people that were together. As Israel, the world of Israel, the Jewish world, is known as having very little art because we're not supposed to make graven images. The other big problem was that Jews had to deal with a lot of anti-Semitism. And we saw last time that many Jews converted to Christian religion so that they could be invited to learn their trade in guilds. And eventually, with revolutions happening all over the European world, in particular 1848, where there were revolution strike points all over the European continent, there was a tremendous move toward democratization of thinking, and there was less anti-Semitism toward the Jews because there was so much more consideration going on around just building countries that were becoming democratized and throwing off monarchies. With a monarchy, what you have is you have structure. You know who the go-to guy is that's the minister of this and the minister of that. When you bring in democracies, this creates a lot of chaos because you don't know who's going to be in charge of what and how you create a meritocracy. All of these things take hundreds of years to work out. And one of the ways that Buber was proposing to these people that we bolster the Jewish identity was to get into place arts and crafts and a visual representation of what we are meant to do in this world. So they founded the school that is known as Bezalel. Bezalel is in Jerusalem, as it has various satellite places. You know, Andre Krauss, Mark, he taught at Bezalel. He said he had a grand old time when all the girls were free and loose. Anyway, and he's one of the professors that teaches for Bayerian. Well, anyway, so Bezalel is named after the man from the Bible that created the Ark of the Covenant. He's the man that was the craftsman, the man that worked with gold. So, you know, Jews work with gold. He made the Ark of the Covenant, which had 2 poles on it that the Jews carried the 10 Commandments in. You know, this is a Bubenheiser for sure. But anyway, so we believe this, you know, but some people believe this. They carried the 10 Commandments in the stone in this golden box wherever they went, and this was the holiest thing they owned, and it was the Arona Kodesh, the holy closet, where we keep the Torahs today. William Morris, then, was the man in the British world, and all of the various philosophers in the European world were concerned about how you bring to the average person the definition of their political world. That's what the job of the arts is, to define the politics that they live under. That's one of the great products of the art world, is it creates creates this framework for what it is that's possible in our world, and it's done first through literature. We said that moments ago. And by the so William Morris is one of these people that is interested in the philosophy of art and in the philosophy of crafts, what it means to a nation, and how the nation can evolve when art is made with spiritual undertones and real, clear intent. He founded the arts and crafts movement, and he was wealthy enough to create a big company. And I'll show you, again, the things that that company did for the British world. They tried to protect the craftsman. That was one of the intents of that philosophy, to protect the craftsman and to further his skills, to pay him well, and to create the kind of objects that are really meaningful, that are handmade by a loving person that has the skill and the will to make beautiful objects that will make your life more aesthetically pleasing. That was an important thing, because I'll show you some pictures of how the interiors of homes looked before this philosophy started to gain ground. Because they were doing, through furnishings, creating order and a home that was a sanctuary. The idea that we have today, a home is not just a place, it's a sanctuary in which you could have spiritual relationship with your things that are minimal. So today, our aesthetic sense is not to have your house omgepatchket. Right? Our spiritual sense tells us that less is more. But that's because we were taught to think that way. If less is more, there's not a lot of clutter, and your home is a sanctuary, a spiritual place. And if you buy things from TJ Maxx, it can still be pretty. But the things that you really, really love are the ones you bought at an art show that a craftsman made. Because they have the heart of that artist in it. This was defined by William Morris and Company. This is why he's important. So we can see here the first two are William Morris Arts and Crafts Home, and the second one is Art and Socialism. Then, in addition to that, what we will see today is Siegfried Bing, who happened to be a very secretive man. There's not too much known about him. He was a very low-key guy, but he was the man that admired William Morris very much. He loved everything to do with arts and crafts and philosophy and all of these wonderful ideas, but he fell madly in love with all things Japanese. So he brought these two ideas together, and he created one of the most important addresses in Paris, a gallery called Nouveau. And this new art was supposed to represent not only the philosophy and the ideals that we have in Western culture, but the simplicity and the inherent beauty of the art forms that are natural from the Japanese world. What we had to work at in the West was to create beautiful objects that we would live with intimately and enjoy. In the Japanese world, this wasn't even a concept that was talked about. It was simply done. It was so much a part of their nature. The way that a stone is put in a Zen garden is done in a delicate manner, because it's all about balance and serenity. And what he noticed was that even ladies' combs were beautifully carved. Little boxes for hat pins or hairpins or buttons or whatever it was that people had. I didn't have buttons in Japan, but they had something, similar. Little boxes made of cloisonne. Everything was decorated, just so simple and so delicate, and all of it represented nature forms and shapes. He loved everything to do with all of these elements because the overriding philosophy of the 1900s is the philosophy of Romanticism. And And Romanticism had nothing to do with romantic love. It had everything to do with the deification of nature. So all of these elements come together at the same time, and we'll see how it's done. So when Japanism came to America, it was done initially kind of by accident, because America had to do business with Japan. We'll see why. And then the Japanism that comes to the Western world will have even more impact right away, because in this 1800s moment, America is not yet industrialized. It's just working on it. But the European world is already well on its way. Art Nouveau, this book is a very good book because it just shows you how pervasive Art Nouveau became. It showed up everywhere. Nature, forms, and shapes were just part of everything. Wallpaper, rugs. It became one of those moments in history that saw this application in every way that it could possibly be done, because it was so relaxing. And it was, well, you know, we're all inspired by nature because of its natural beauty, and because we generally cannot control nature until we have global warming, of course. Then these DVDs are killer. When I tell you killer, I am so serious. Paris was a woman brilliant about how women are going to create the modern art world. And then Picasso, naturally, he'll be very important. We'll talk about him and Gertrude Stein and Alfred Stieglitz, how this notion of modern art will liberate the 20th century. It'll be one of the most important events in the 20th century. Abstract art is going to break away from anything that ever happened prior to that moment in history, 1907, and it will liberate everyone. Because abstract art represents something that doesn't really exist in reality. It represents a thought, an idea, an emotion. And if you say that a museum can have in it abstract art, and in another room Rubens, you are saying they are equal in their impact. And we'll see how important that will be. Pollock and Andy Warhol, so we'll do that toward the end. But if you can, you will enjoy enormously the only DVD that I've ever found on Siegfried Bing, which will give you hours of pleasure just looking at what he did and how he did it, and how sincere it all was. It's just touching from the very beginning. It's called Mr. Bing and La Nouveau, and Art Nouveau.
You have a printout of that?
I'm going to send it. I'm collecting it.
Okay.
Did you get that printout?
I got it on mine, but I don't have a printer here, but I'll print it out when I get it.
Yeah, and I will add a few more things as I remember them and find them. So Mr. Bing and La Nouveau was directed, the director, I think perhaps even the writer of it is Francois Levy, L-E-V-I-E, that's how they spell Levy in French. Francois Levy. I'm going to send it to you, but it's called Mr. Bing and Art Nouveau, and La Nouveau. Yeah, so I think we're ready to kind of start then, and you know, I don't know if I start way too early in history to kind of bring you up to the present, but see, I'm obsessive. And, and I just have to tell you everything. Don't ask me about my grandchildren. I just have to tell you everything about everything. Oh, and by the way, Mark is making a video today for the people that couldn't attend. And Mark is my best friend. He's my husband. He's very, very nice to me most of the time. If you have a telephone, please turn it off, okay? What I'm going to attempt to cover today is, let's see, changes taking place in society promote new ideas in the arts. Arts often join new ideas with the classical world. This is one of the ways that artists redefine their ideas, is always being tied to the classical world, but we see how they change it, and we'll continue to see that throughout the next lectures. And then what the important points I want to make is, what were the changes taking place that were so definitive in their way? There were aggressive and sweeping political changes were being manifested. The deification of nature was an answer to industrialization and urbanization. Women's roles in society were being redefined, and artistic output and daring commentary was encouraged because art became a marketable commodity. So, as I said, what is one of the earth-shattering moments that happened in the late 1700s, 1800s, is America was able to institute a democracy that hadn't existed in the Western world for some 1,500 plus years. This was a big, big thing. It was such a big thing that we know that after our revolution was over in 1783, in 1789, just 6 years later, we see the French Revolution. The French Revolution was going to have many problems because they had to unseat a monarch. And there are very few people in the world that can afford to pay for war, that can feed an army, that can clothe and arm and feed an army. The consequence was that it actually took them until 1781 to have a proper democracy, because the government that is in France today is known as the Fifth Republic, which means that they had to unseat 4 monarchies that kept coming back and commandeering their position according to familial connections and the financial position that they were in and able to do it. So they had to unseat 4 more monarchies to finally bring the democracy to the French world that exists even today. The idea, though, didn't seem that it would be so incredibly difficult. They didn't know that this is what their future held for them, because the ideas of the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment, which fueled our American Revolution and the French Revolution, were going to dominate their thinking, and they had to have young men willing to die for a cause that they weren't sure was going to come to pass. So one of the ways that they did this is, we said, art has powerful components. And one of the ways that they did that is Jacques-Louis David made paintings like this at the time that those men that were trying to bring about a true democracy and unseat Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they had to make these kind of paintings to get young men energized to the point where they would be willing to die for a cause that was not yet sure. They do this by going to the classical world often, because the classical world, the Greek and Roman classical world, represents geniuses that were incredibly powerful, that had long-lived institutions. The Greek Golden Age, the Roman Golden Age were incredibly powerful, conquering nations that stayed in place for many hundreds of years. If you tell stories from the foundation of Western civilization, and you tell young men that you can be connected to this great history, one of the ways you do it is by making representations of stories that took place during that classical age. This happens to be a story of 3 sons, and their name was Horatii, I believe is how it's said. They were going to serve for the Roman legions, or a legion, and you can see the father there, who is handing them the 3 swords as they are swearing an oath to the French Revolution to bring about democracy, as these young men were going to defend democracy in Rome. The father has already spilled a lot of blood for his nation. He's covered in red. And he now is issuing this decree that the sons must go and defend democratic ideals. And of course we know that the generations there are well aware of the fact that their sons or fathers or brothers may not come back. The way that he creates this story, though, because David worked for the revolution that was the monarchy, and he was an independent person in many ways. Whoever wanted him to make a painting, he made a painting. So here what we have then is not only are we connected to the story, because this is known as the Oath of the Horatii, which people would have probably known about, but you have the columns from the Greek world and the arches of the Roman world. So this connection to the ancient world says to young men, be a hero like these men before you. You will be tied to history as well. You will be remembered as one of the great warriors. When the French Revolution did take place, and one of the men that became the dominant force in making this democracy work, so everyone thought, was going to be Napoleon. Napoleon, in fact, wanted right away to be known as the great judge and the great leader of the French world. He was going to, write the Napoleonic Code. He was going to do various things that were not only going to make democracy the way of the government of France, but he was going to conquer the rest of the world. He was going to be like Alexander the Great. Though you can see very clearly he is on tentative ground. All his force has to do is move 1/4 of an inch, and it's all over. So you see, David works for everyone, but he also tells you some big truths with some little lies. Here in all, the other thing that's very important is Andre puts Napoleon seated there in a way that only great judges sit, like Moses, Michelangelo's Moses, like Zeus that sat on a throne, like Abraham Lincoln sit on a throne. Those people that want to create a just world sit. Therefore, what we have is, we have this representation of a man who is a conquering hero and also a man that is going to institute a new government which is going to serve the people. Problem is, he had a huge ego, and apparently he had a Napoleonic complex. So what he did was, when it looked like he wasn't going to be re-elected by democratic process, he simply crowned himself emperor. Another David painting, in which he now is going to be the dictator of not only the French world, but the European world. And if you dare stand up to him and his Ottoman soldiers, who were considered to be the best soldiers in the world, they were mercenary soldiers for anyone that would employ them, he simply walked into Madrid and these men just started with these swords cutting people's heads off that were in their way if they were going to stand up to them. And if you dared live through this debacle, you were going to get it the next morning. So this kind of destruction of innocent people that didn't even know why or who was there, because don't forget, the Spanish world had been commandeered by the Moors for hundreds of years. So they didn't know if the Arabs were back. They didn't know exactly who they were even fighting against. But why were these people with these turbans coming to Madrid, destroying their people? If they indeed were trying to protect their people, they too were mowed down by Napoleon's armies. In addition to that, what happens is that there's something very shameful, even after Napoleon is done away with and sent to the island of Elba and various other 2 islands, I think, and he manages to get off. But there was an event that took place that was absolutely riveting as a story, and corruption at its worst, and an absolute shame and scandal for the French world. And that was this painting that was commemorated here by Géricault, called The Raft of the Medusa. The Raft of the Medusa was a story in which a large frigate, which I'm not sure frigate, that was a big boat was crossing the ocean, and there were various officers that were staying in the upper decks, and this and that, and then the crew was in the bottom, and they hit something, and the boat started to add water, and when it did, the officers, who are of course always sworn to protect everyone on board first and then last, they took the lifeboats, and everyone else was left to fend for themselves. About 150 men ended up on this large raft that they happened to create for breaking a wall away from the boat. And to survive the 15 days that they were on the water, to survive, they had to commit cannibalism. Maybe 12 to 15 people survived. And those revolutionaries that were against the new monarchy that had taken over after Napoleon disappeared were so reviled by all this that they asked the Géricault to make this large painting, which is something like 24 feet across. And they particularly made it so large to insult the government all the more, because something is far more realistic when the people in it are about your size. If you've ever seen this at the Louvre, it's enormous, and it is a story of real tragedy and the kind of corruption that takes place when only some people count and others don't. In fact, some of the people that survived were the ones that modeled for him. And here you can see he's painting them in a very heroic way, like warriors with muscles, because 15 days with no food or water, you don't look like this. The effect was that this is one problem that the government is having, many problems that the government is having. There are lots of revolutionaries that want to bring democracy, and they want to change the world that they live under. And at the same time, the beginning of the 1800s, in the French world, already in the British world, we have a lot of industrialization that's taken place. And at this time, 1820 or so, 1818, we have massive industrialization that's taking place all over the European world. And these kind of foundries that have to burn 24 hours a day are putting lots and lots of people to work, but at minuscule wages. And whereas people were effectively slaves to the land in a feudal system, they are now slaves to a machine in foundries. Paid little tiny bits of money, living in these kind of slums all over downtown areas close to the foundries and close to their locations of work. This one happens to be in the New York area, but this is the way all of these areas of downtown centers looked. And then eventually you get the kind of revolt from workers that are being exploited. In the United States, we see these kind of worker strikes, but these kind of worker strikes were taking over all over the European world. And the effect of these kind of worker strikes is those powerful people that control the factory systems employed private police force that didn't have to answer to a government. And Pinkerton police beat the heck out of you if you weren't going to get back to work. You can't just bring companies to a halt with 400,000 people walking off the job one day. And that's the kinds of things they were doing to impress their employers that they wanted a raise. In the United States, it brings about the progressive era, which comes relatively late, but America is growing and growing and growing, so you finally get these kind of photographs and stories of people that are living on the edge of poverty, what kind of calamities they have to experience every day. So in America, we have this to deal with as a result of all of the problems created by industrialization. Now, the European world had the same problems, but at least in our country, we were living in a democracy. In the European world, they were living largely in the 1800s under monarchies still. When you start to get paintings like this by Friedrich, for example, what you see is the awesomeness of nature and how little man is in comparison to the grandeur and the great spirit of nature. Friedrich was a sincerely like a sincere and wonderful representative of this new idea that came to be known as Romanticism, which had to do with the deification of nature and the revulsion of mankind toward man-made institutions that kept impoverished people down. So man-made institutions would be institutions that have to do with government, in which the laws are written to better the wealthy. Institutions in the church, in which only some people are rewarded, and most people that are working low on the scale of the church, like the vicar, gets virtually nothing, whereas the reverend gets everything, but the reverend bought that position, and he will never again pay tax because he bought that position. In the military, you bought positions, though you may not have gone to an academy one day in your life. You never again pay taxes because why? You paid a fortune for that position. And then all the underlings who eat rotten meat, but you eat caviar because you have money. All of these institutions keeping people married that have money. The men can have a mistress, but this is the business of incorporating two families. All of these man-made institutions, because of the revulsion of what we see in the paintings of those people that have nothing and then those people that have everything, this turning away from this rigged system became known as Romanticism. And in Romanticism, what happens is first you start to get paintings of the glory of nature because man cannot manipulate nature. Nature has its own laws that we have to knuckle under to. And man is not supreme, but we all know that mankind must be intertwined with nature. We must have nature, and we must live in it well. So to accommodate ourselves into this picture of what the reality is, you can't just be spiritual and think of nature as a wonderful thing. You have to be intertwined with nature and be one with nature. Consequently, you see paintings in which farmers and the proportion of man to nature becomes more equal. But this aversion toward the people that have everything makes the arts move toward people that have nothing because they look like they are incorruptible because they have nothing to be corrupted with. So we start to see that kind of representation in art, where those people that have been anonymous forever, those people that are working in the wheat fields and breaking their back collecting wheat, are shown in the heroic position. Because if you notice in the pediments of the Parthenon, people were shown in profile. So he is very specifically painting them in profile. But in addition to that, in the background, you can see that there are hills, mountains of wheat that men in three-piece black suits are controlling. Because this system is rigged. And the man on the low end of the totem pole just barely survives. So if this is the European world is making its move in this way. In the United States, we made our move through the writings of transcendentalists who were already in the 1800s writing about how this country is being mowed down and how lumber is being destroyed and how trees are being destroyed and what will happen to our country. In 1800 they were writing. Transcendentalist core beliefs are that man transcends the physical world through his instincts and intuition rather than through the doctrines of established religions. And a man, when he feels close to nature, is more spiritual and therefore can be more authentic. They did not believe, in fact, we know these were primarily Unitarians. They were primarily Unitarians, and their expression shows up in the work of the Hudson River School, the awesomeness of nature. And the way that this idea, as the United States, and the European world is always very tightly intertwined because our immigrants are all coming from the European world, and primarily, and they're bringing those same philosophies and ideas with them to America. So what we see in the French world as a way of bringing nature back to cities that are being gobbled up by slums and factories is this is the way architecture is starting to look. Architecture moves away from classical pieces like the Parthenon and Pantheon and does in its way, those designers that are doing this kind of thing are bringing nature back to the city centers because nature is so far away. Farms, places where you grow, you know, where the trees grow, all of these are moving further and further and further away from city centers. And this is the response. But in addition to that, of course, you see a lovely woman's face there, whose hair comes down a little bit like a helmet, if you notice. She's a bit of a warrior, if you will. But we'll see what she's going to do in the next few decades. She'll accomplish a lot. And then if the interior must match the exterior, so therefore you're going to have this kind of look. So what you get is one of those first times in history, the very first time you get the idea of design for a purpose is William Morris. This is the next level that will come from the interest in Oriental motifs, in the love of nature, and in design and furnishings in which your home can be a restful place. Now, in addition to all this, do you have any questions? Do you want to take a little break and ask a few questions, or are you all cool with everything?
I'm sure if I do.
Okay. So now, what is going to happen in America that is going to bring many of these aspects together that will result in this in France? In the 1830s or so, even maybe 1840s, Commodore Perry, who was working for the United States, a U.S. citizen, was involved, he was a naval officer, and he was involved in what was going to happen in the United States when we were beginning to build railroad veins. The railroad systems that we built in the United States were minimal initially, and what we have is railroad systems that are going to be running there through the 13 states, or the Northeast corridor primarily, as the South is invested in other interests. And the United States knows that it cannot become a world power without having significant transportation systems. And at this time, because we have such a large country, we have to have extensive railroad systems. When this is a fact, and everyone wants, through that doctrine of manifest destiny, they want to keep going from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And when this is the case, and since all of the minerals that are required to build railroads are all located in this location, Pittsburgh, all these areas where you have coal and iron ore, then the only way that they're going to make this happen, to go from this East Coast to the West Coast, is if the United States sends Commodore Perry across the water. They're going to send him from that San Francisco area to the straightest line they could possibly make, in which they would find a port of call, or where our sailors and merchant marines can rest, and also where they might have coal and iron ore to sell us. As it happened, it was Japan. Had it not been Japan, they would have continued probably to Korea. But what we have then is this understanding that Japan has the minerals we need, has the raw materials, and then the men that come here in the great numbers that come here will bring something back to their loved one in the United States. And they will bring some little boxes made of poison egg, or they will make, things, lovely little things for their loved ones. This will be the first time that America will be exposed to the Oriental arts. This is about 1840 or so. What will happen as a result of this association and cooperation with the two countries is that we will be able to begin to build the railroad from that San Francisco area, and they will meet in Utah. Eventually, when that golden spike goes in 1869, and we have this important documents that have already made all this happen, we even are introduced to the way that they make art, which is significantly different than the way we make art. And these kind of wood blocks were representational of the document that was signed. And the man, Commodore Perry, is a man sitting in the center. No, standing, sorry. He must be standing. He has something around him. And this is another general, perhaps, that was working with him. And then we have the official from the Japanese world. That convention of Kanagawa, 1855, there were many decades then that we were going back and forth to the Japanese world, and so we became well schooled in the Oriental arts, and that's when Japanism came to America. But in this 1855 period is when we know that we have the Crystal Palace Exposition that takes place in London, which is a magnificent business opportunity. This is the reason it was put on. It was a huge exhibition for the purpose of import-export. Nations from all over the world were invited to show their wares here. There were 14,000 exhibitions, or items on exhibition, and at least half of them were from the British Crown countries and England. The result was that everyone became more and more interested in arts and crafts. And of course you can only have this happen if industrialization does happen, because industrialization is not all bad. Industrialization means there are people that have more money to spend. Because there's interest around gathering these kind of knickknacks and having your home, you know, this museum, if you will, of little things that you're buying that you confirm to yourself you've really made it. You live in a nice house. As sometimes it can go very, very wrong, but still, to some people, this was their taste. They were more than happy to show the world all of the lovely things they could buy. But the arts and crafts movement created a moment in which people started to ask questions about the benefit of art and what does art actually do for mankind, how important is it, and how does this fit into the big scheme of things. So this is one of those moments in which we get that classic argument that asks the question of the value of art. And some people said art for art's sake is important. You just must make art because it's beautiful. It's lovely to own. Whereas these two men, who are John Ruskin and, who's this other man? I can't remember. John Ruskin and Matthew Arnold. They were utilitarian philosophers who thought things that have utility are worthwhile making, and when people are starving in the streets of London, what's the point of making pretty things? So they represent the counter philosophy to utilitarianism and make objects that people can use. They don't have to necessarily be pretty, but then they will go against the French, who have their own philosopher writing this concept of art should be made because it has spiritual components, etc. And then we have William Morris with one of the many men that will found with him the William Morris Company, that will go about taking stories from the Arthurian legends, let's say, and creating these kind of interiors for wealthy people. It has the connection of the ancient world, the connection that this is one of those moments in history where they have a democracy, short-lived democracy, King Arthur and so on. And it also creates opportunities for craftspeople to have jobs. It protects the craft in that people will be purchasing these things. And so it works very well. And they had nothing but acrimonious feelings toward machine-made rubbish. What the William Morris Company wants to do then is it wants to make everything far more simple, far more sedate. Your home is not a place that just has junk in it. It's a home where you can rest and relax. And in this time of great industrialization, with a lot of people moving, a lot of noise around you that has never been present before, a lot of motion, a lot of trains, a lot of extraneous things that people don't even know exactly how they're going to cope with the changing times. Your home must be a sanctuary, because where else can you relax? So this philosophy, it comes to pass in a meaningful way, in which men that are good at doing various things with woodwork or tile work, as everything that was made in this house, excuse me, this is prior to electricity being invented as a means of lighting a home, but everything in this home that's so simplified in this way was all made by the William Morris Company, and they worked in every art form imaginable. They were interested in making stained glass, but stained glass right now is just being painted. It's just glass that's being painted. We will see what Tiffany will do with it. They will also create the Morris chair, which is really interesting because this is the first time that you don't have to sit in a 90-degree angle in a chair. So it tells you people have time to relax. If you have a lounging chair, people have time to relax. And you could move it, you know, with the rod. You could move the rod in the back of the chair to make it at different angles. So what happens is this application of a philosophy is coming out through art. And it's coming out in a way that's meaningful and utilitarian and appropriate. And though William Morris himself was a genius beyond words, in which he would, for example, translate Icelandic folk tales in his spare time. So he's a man that has respect for everything, and one of the things he has biggest respect for is intellectual, evolution of a person. So he begins to decorate his company begins to decorate books in this way, that even a book is a jewel to own. This became interesting in the United States to Elbert Hubbard, if some of you have been to East Aurora, New York, where there was a very large association of American artisans that fell under the title of Roycroft. Maybe some of you have heard of this. But Roycroft houses were similar in many ways. Roycroft interior design was similar in many ways to William Morris. Simple, but William Morris was all about everything being handmade and having the spirit and the love and the touch of the craftsman. But Roycroft was more practical, and they did a lot of things with machines first, and then the craftsman finished it. You can see this is a compatible picture that we saw moments before with William Morris. And what we will see with Louis Comfort Tiffany, who, while the French world in 1871 till 1914 is experiencing the Belle Epoque era, we are experiencing the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age is first going to be defined by those robber barons that can afford to have beautiful things, and then more and more people are going to want to purchase things as they get wealthier, the result of America becoming industrialized and powerful. Charles Louis Tiffany, the father of Louis Comfort Tiffany, has a store first that is a fancy goods emporium. A fancy goods emporium was a place where you bought beautiful things that were decorative items for your home. And his son, Louis Comfort Tiffany, who will be gifted in every way imaginable, as a young man decides to get together with this woman, whose name was Candace Wheeler, who's the American mother of interior design. And he gets together with this other painter, Samuel Coleman, who painted in the Hudson River style for a time, and also various other styles. And then this man, Lockwood de Forest, who was a painter himself, but was more interested from a practical point of view of interior design to wood carving and metal smithing. And together, the four of them create the Louis Comfort Tiffany Company when he's just in his 20s or early 30s. And for example, they get these kind of major commissions. This is the home of Mark Twain. They also decorated the White House for important fetes, and they did all kinds of things. And their grand work, one of their grand works, is the decoration of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. All of this done by the Louis Comfort Tiffany associated artists. Everything that was made for this hotel, and this is the first hotel that will have electric lights in it. because first you have to convince the public the house is not going to go up in a fire. So Bertha Palmer permitted the Palmer House Hotel to be connected electrical. This is a picture of it having been redone now, the cost of many millions of dollars. But all of this mosaic work, the painting, all of these decorative elements, for the United States, we didn't have Art Nouveau that looked flowery and whiplash. Ours looked more rigid, if you will, but it was decorative because it was more connected to the classical world. Louis Comfort Tiffany was not kind of a loosey-goosey guy, you know, whiplash, this and that. But later, of course, he's going to be very much intertwined with Art Nouveau gallery with Siegfried being, so he's going to change his style. But so this is how everything looks at the moment, and he will eventually meet this man. So let's take a 10-minute break, and when we come back, we can talk about how this continues to grow.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
What was this person made with the pan to get the steel to undo?
What did America do to get? They ripped them off royally.
That's what I thought. We exploited them hard.
In fact, they said World War II was revenge even for way back then, because what they should have paid them hundreds of dollars for, they paid them. So the man that was invested in every way imaginable in making Art Nouveau a dominant force, which of course he didn't know. He founded this gallery that it would have the impact that it had. But he was bringing so much together. So his name was Siegfried Bing, and he's the man there on the left, sitting in like a pagoda style that was built in his backyard, I believe, where he invited people to have tea with him. He was so besotted with all things Japanese. He came from a Jewish family from Hamburg, and his father was a ceramics manufacturer. So he was interested in ceramics to begin with, and then when he went to the Japanese world and was introduced to the kind of motifs that they used, he was even more enamored with it, and he made extensive use of molds and shapes that he brought from the Japanese world. In his father's company, and also was just a major importer to the European world, and he printed that magazine called, you know, the Japan. And it was printed on a very regular basis, introducing the Western world to their art forms, how they made screens, why they used certain shapes, how their existence was very much part of the nature that was around them, and how they brought nature into their life. And it's interesting that you brought up, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Barbara.
Oh, Barbara just said she loves Frank Lloyd Wright. Well, of course, the big secret of this lecture is Frank Lloyd Wright, and way down toward the end, how he is going to take these ideas and in his way, more rigid way, but a more applicable to everyday life way, he's going to also fall madly in love with all of these things related to the Oriental world. Being in the 1850s or 60s or so, he was already so taken with all of this information coming from the Oriental world that he visited the Orient and stayed for a year. He couldn't get over how they lived, how the house was simple and small and had light in it, and the gardens, even the way the stones were placed, the way the steps, everything was done in a way in which they communed with nature every moment of the day. And they even took natural materials, nature shapes, to continue to elaborate on this theme in the pottery they used, in the teacups that they used to drink. So he was then inspiring, in this case, a French glassmaker and furniture designer by the name of Emile Gallet. And here what we can see is East meets West in many ways. But this pervasive intent in bringing nature to the world is going to be the whole reason for being for Tiffany. Tiffany's works, though he will be America's Michelangelo, because he will be able to do everything imaginable, including photography and painting, and of course he's going to create the kind of stained glass that the world has never seen before. Because he will do it, and because he will eventually inherit millions of dollars from his father, and be so dedicated to the arts that he will die a pauper, there will not be even one project that he will ever do in which he made a profit. He always had to go into his pocket, because he was interested in supporting craftsmen, in supporting female craftswomen too, who wanted to work in the arts. And here you can see he's applying the ideas that will come from the Japanese world, more flowy, more whiplash, more of these kind of sinewy designs. And he will become a major glass manufacturer. He's going to set up a huge, I think in Corona, Queens, is that right? Corona, Queens? Huge glass manufacturing company employing hundreds of people. And here what you can see is the detail. Now this kind of glass is manufactured in variegated shapes and sizes and finishes so that it all looks natural. And he will have these pieces of glass made in sheets in thousands of colors, I kid you not. Thousands of variegated colors so that you can create shading that's necessary so that it will look authentic. And it will not be painted, it will be embedded in the glass. And he will pay for lots of patents as well. He will patent the only thing that will be painted, by the way, in his works is the faces. And he will paint the faces. And they will be embedded in glass as well. He was an innovator in every way imaginable. And he even invented this kind of fluorescent glass, iridescent glass, that he initially began to experiment by taking taking butterfly wings off butterflies, because there's dust that's fluorescent on their wings, and he will crush millions of wings of butterflies, but eventually they will do this with a chemical process.
Is that what they call Favril?
Favril. Yeah, thank you. I couldn't think of it. Favril glass, and he will work in pottery. All of these motifs then come to the American world from innovations done at Tiffany Studios and the influence of the arts and crafts movement, which will be infused with new ideas that come from the Japanese world as well. Expanded the vocabulary. In the exposition of 1900, the Universal Exposition, Louis Comfort Tiffany will show his windows to the world, which you can see in Winter Park here. And they are astounding to the extent that he won something like 57 ribbons or gold medals for his work. So the kind of work that he will do, and the kind of work that Emile Gallet and Jean Dom, maybe you've heard of him as well, the fact that nature will become dominant in all of these objects of art. They will make their way into costume jewelry and even hood ornaments for cars. And they will be part of ornamental iron. All of this will be the result of Japanism coming to the American world and then coming to the European world. So Clint, clearly we can see he adored all things Japanese. Not only the fact that they made their art two-dimensional, whereas in the Western world, we are used to seeing our art in 3 dimensions, and I'll show you some examples of that. But what happens with Siegfried is he became the last word for, if you want to get this kind of modern art style, furnishings, objects of art, paintings, even fabrics, all these things that you could get through a big retail store. Later, he has in his gallery, which he has to expand, move to another location, and he becomes a consummate businessman that is in love with the spirituality of art. When he went on his trip and continued to have these connections with the Japanese world, what was obvious to Western artists is that they made their art in a way in which they didn't use perspective that we are used to seeing that looks like this. In the Western world, we like to tell a big story, and we have this, we are buttressed by all things Greco-Roman, as this is what was respected in the great art schools that were first in the Roman and Florentine world, and later the French world. The Roman world was the head of art for 300 years, and then the principal players in the art world then were the French for 300 years. So we are always taking from the foundation of Western civilization. Therefore, when we made these kind of paintings, the introduction of focal point perspective during the Renaissance makes us create kind of a window to the world. This is how we see the world. The world looks natural to us. This is the way the human eye sees. So consequently, we are telling the stories in a way in which the world continues way beyond the picture. In the Oriental world, they make the kind of representations in which there is the illusion of perspective, so that Mount Fuji is way in the background there, and this tsunami, the story that's taking place there of people being caught in the ship and all this business, is a story about the thunderous presence of nature, how powerful it is, and the whole story is about this great wave. We tell stories about great people. They tell stories about the greatness of nature, which fits very beautifully with Romanticism. But what you have is this introduction of a new vocabulary, and to the art world looks like this. It's two-dimensional, it has all of these curly cues and waves, and though their art is principally involved with their deification of nature, their natural relationship to nature, and they like to use gold motifs very often. It's kind of this kind of addition of this golden element of luxury, and they like just simple stories about a bird, a plant, a group of flowers. So we see that artists can move beyond these kind of stories and say, even though Renoir tells you this story with focal point perspective of the Moulin de la Galette, then just a few years later, we see that it is being significantly flattened. Not so much dimension here. It's more flat and takes more from the influence of the Oriental world. When you get to these kind of works here that you see that have all of these golden attributes, we will eventually find this in Klimt, all of the gold. But before we get to Klimt, we see that American women and European women were absolutely crazy about everything to do with the Oriental art world, and galleries were springing up everywhere. And these lovely girls that are wearing corsets that have fainting couches in case they can't breathe are even willing to bend all the way down to look at all the detail here and the screens and all of these shapes that come from the Oriental world, the wood carvings, all of this telling you that we are becoming significantly intertwined with East and West. Even in something as simple as a portrait like this of Emile Zola, we can see that Manet has that screen in there. He has the inkwell, the shade from the Oriental world. He has the man in the kimono. So all of this is making its way. And Emile Zola, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that he played a significant role eventually in the Dreyfus affair. Yes, he's the one that wrote that article accusing the French government of corruption, anti-Semitism toward Emile Zola. Dreyfus. But so this is also one of the reasons that Manet makes his portrait. He admired him all along, and every artist must have a good publicist. So a writer is very important to an artist. But he did this because he represented this man. He thought that he was on the right side of various questions, and eventually we will know that this is in fact true. in this situation. What we see with Vincent van Gogh, who was selling, hoping to sell, I should say, through the Art Nouveau gallery, some of his artwork, but nobody purchased it. But you can see that he too is becoming significantly influenced by this Oriental design. And it's part of his language then. He's able to incorporate his work and the aesthetic of that. That Japanism that comes to Vienna and the European world, we begin to see in the works of Klimt. And certainly we know that his work is representational of the beautiful fabrics that came from kimonos of the Oriental world. And Adele Bloch-Bauer, you see, has all these combinations of the Oriental motifs with all of the decoration, all of the gold. But Klimt must tell you that he knows all of art history from the beginning of time, so naturally she is the Mona Lisa of the Viennese world. She sits in about the same posture. The way that they created drama in their work was in the body posture itself and in using deep colors. So that when the Japanese were making this kind of art, it too began to filter into the artistic work of Jules Charest and Toulouse-Lautrec, because this became an important art form. Advertising became a very important art form because it was business and art, but because of people's love for the Oriental woodblock. This is, of course, why we begin to see that. And then the gestures that are represented in some of these works are what convey the dynamic aspect of it. Jeanne Avril, by the way, is the woman that is placed in this painting, practically taking up more space than just about anyone else, and she is very comfortable there in the table in the blue dress, the white hat, and she's very comfortable, as this is really a beautiful picture of what democracy should look like. Lots of people from all walks of life, very wealthy people in the background that have all the proper clothes on. They would never, in their wildest dreams, be seen out of public without a three-piece suit, high collar hat, and gloves. And then you see these two people sitting in undershirts. She is ensconced in that place there, very well ensconced, as Renoir said, that we can learn many things from many people, no matter what walks of life they come from, even those people that throw their skirts up and show you their bloomers. But still, what is important and so just incredibly beautiful about this aspect is we start to see these kind of dynamic poses and stories being told in this way. And this happens largely in the European world, whereas we don't have a lot of pressure on us in America because Louis Comfort Tiffany is doing so much in the arts and crafts. But when we see that this kind of room that is in the Smithsonian that was designed by James McNeill Whistler is in every way representational of not only Art Nouveau, because it's inspired in every way, by the shapes of the pottery, porcelain, by these kind of screens with the gold motifs, and then you even have Art Nouveau as Mother Nature and that kind of ceiling that is kind of a web design, a spider's web design. Though not to forget, in a very prominent location, we get this beautiful American geisha. William Merritt Chase was doing this kind of work where he is including this East and West idea with the silks of Japan. The woman here has probably adopted that hairstyle from the geisha as well, as I believe the Gibson girl starts to wear her hair in that way. These flowers are indigenous to that part of the world. So what happens is the standards as they were are going to change dramatically. The standards as they were for hundreds of years, thousands of years, all over the world were that you teach architects to design the greatness of the Greco-Roman world, and so that anything that comes out from the Western world should be replicating the greatness of the ancients. Well, this gets extremely tiresome besides which you can't build buildings that have a lot of unique ideas if you're constantly staying with this rigid style. So we start to see this artistic movement take its form and shape in architectural design, and that though nature always inspires us, we begin to see in this Art Nouveau period, which is usually 1890 to 1914, the next big period is going to be Art Deco, and Art Deco will also be inspired by nature in many ways, but it will be far more geometric, and machine-made materials will determine how you will design a building, because you will have to have very large open spaces to accommodate many thousands of people walking through your doors every day, whether it's skyscrapers or train stations. It will be done geometrically, because to continue to make these kind of designs will be enormously expensive. So that Art Nouveau, when you have these kind of security doors or windows, as beautiful as they are extremely costly, because nothing is machine-made here. It's all handmade, and it's all made specifically to be used in one building only. It will have to eventually go way beyond that. You see flower motifs here, nature forms and shapes, all expensive. Later there will be far more machine tooling that will turn that out. But Art Nouveau is one of the first movements because it became dominant. Nature forms and designs became dominant in everything. It came to be known as a Gesamtkunstwerk. Gesamtkunstwerk is the word that Wagner came up with. So he said it was a term in which a comprehensive work of art embraces all of the arts, whether it's designing hairpins or designing architecture. And we know that Wagner designed his staging, his costuming for his actors, and he wrote the music and the libretto. Genius he was, but unpalatable. Here again, we see Hector Guimard is known for making this kind of style, which came to be known as Art Nouveau in Paris, and also style metro. When they had to finally make this first underground metro stations in the major arrondissement for the next big exposition that was taking in place, Art Nouveau was popular at this time, so we get all of these decorative elements. Art Nouveau was big in Belgium as well, though in this case, in the Victor Horta house, the exterior was somewhat less kind of imbued with nature forms and shapes on the exterior, but interior, it looks like we're walking through a park. So these kind of structural motifs are used to be utilitarian and very beautiful, and to keep you connected to light, and this is what makes everything more natural according to the Japanese aesthetic. So there will be lots of use of these kind of lights now, these skylights, and the motifs all representative of nature forms. The furniture will look like this, and all of this combination of work then shows you that everything is well married. This went all over the world because it was an opportunity for architects to go beyond the neoclassical representations of buildings. In the Spanish world, it was known as modernism, and you can see even in the Sagrada Familia Church, these look like stalagmites and stalactites, basically, kind of dripped in this way. And in the German world, it was known as secession style or the young style, Jugendstil. So that when you see these kind of buildings right next to each other, which is a very big part of the European landscape, makes it so interesting. This is the kind of construction that takes a lot of craftsmen's hours, a lot of individual work. This one has far less work in it because you can decorate the building with paint. Probably it's done with fresco, kind of, so it becomes part of the masonry. You can add decorative elements at the street level. decorative elements, in this case, perhaps to protect a skylight, but less work and less money is invested because at this time the craftsmen are going to demand more pay. There are going to be unions all over the world. So the craftsman is going to demand more pay, and the consequence is that architects will have to think of ways that they can make more simple things and keep the cost down. And you've been there?
I saw that, yeah.
And style liberty in Italy is there. Now, I think it's wonderful to discuss what happens in this. Carol, I'm sorry, I'm doing a repeat of another lecture, which was part of something else. But this, it all comes together all the time, so how can you stay away from it? What you see is Latvia, of all places, is one of the countries that has something like 800 Art Nouveau buildings. Though nationalism was also a very big part of the way the European world was being defined. So though on the one hand, you can see that there are lovely motifs and lovely things here that are nature inspired, we also now get these female bodies intertwined because female bodies have lots of curves. So they fit very nicely with whiplash designs. But that kind of romantic nature, feminine inspired, coupled with nationalism we see here, in which we saw this woman with helmet-like hair here, who is more gentle and maybe a little bit more held back. This one is very much sure of herself. Square jaw, eyes that are serious, a helmet, and you can see that this architect then is taking from these ideas that are becoming modern, but women are changing so dramatically, and the role of women is changing so dramatically that for the first time in history, they do not have to be reliant or answer to a man. They can support themselves. They don't necessarily have to marry. They have problems, which are told and discussed in these kind of books, as to what choices women should make, what choices men should make in respect to women. And we know that this interest in becoming labor leaders, in demanding birth control, in the fact that women even become major athletes, will lead to their position in the world, their prestige in the world, and their ability to define themselves. So when you see this kind of work that was done many thousands of years ago in the Egyptian world, where this idea came from to have these kind of large pieces of sculpture, the Egyptian world eventually makes its way into the Greek world. But here what we see is, not only do we have a warrior who is strong and sure of herself, we also have these maidens who are pregnant with new ideas. And they also have a laurel wreath, because a great Olympian warrior would get a laurel wreath if he won. So they consider themselves to be winners. They are now winners, and they are very sure of themselves, square jaw like the Statue of Liberty, and they even have the gargoyle component there that you can see, and they even have the association of the peacock, which comes down to us from the peacock that was Hera's bird. Hera was the supreme goddess of all the goddesses and gods. Her husband was Zeus. He was a lout, but never mind. She is shown with a peacock. He is always shown with an eagle. So what we have then is this wonderful kind of representation in which this takes from all the ancient world, brings it way forward, and makes us see what a modern woman looks like. Because a modern woman is a woman that is far more relaxed. She no longer wears a corset. She no longer does things that you have to do. In fact, she might even decide, because she's supporting herself, to begin to smoke. And if you don't like what she does, she has this asp on the front of her forehead there that will bite you well and good if you have anything to say in the negative. What's the fringe called? On the woman's hair, fringe? What's it called? Bangs. Her bangs are an ass. Or a little curl. So they're moving away from this girl who is all tied up nice and tight, and corset, and everything is covered, but the décolletage of the woman was permitted to be shown because that was your calling card. That's what you showed the boys in the background. Here, what you can see is these women are traveling together. Now it's appropriate for women to travel if they have a chaperone. They can go different parts of the world, but don't get ahead of yourself and go along without a chaperone, because you are sure to encounter a large dog that's going to bite your leg. And see, even something as simple as this. This is trying to sell you a Peugeot bicycle, right? But how does this artist connect you to the ancient world? What does he do? He has a Greek temple in the background. You see? He wants you to know that he too knows art history, though he is a lowly lithograph designer. And then one of the most compelling aspects of this is Madame Butterfly. Well, this is a story because so many men from the Americas were going to Japan, and they were being intertwined with these young girls that wanted desperately, some of them, to escape the geisha house, which they visited. And they were, when you signed a marriage contract in Japan, it lasts 999 years. They had fun with these girls for a short time. So now we know, of course, why Mr. Pinkerton has his name. His name is Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton. Why do you think? Police. The Pinkerton police. He brutalized her just like they brutalized people. And then to add insult to injury, Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton. Clever, very clever. When Frank Lloyd Wright was in his, let me see, he was born 1860 something, so we're talking, he's in his 30s when this Columbian exposition takes place. And when he does, he's already enamored with Japanism. In fact, he was a man that never had enough money, ever, because he spent it more quickly than he made it. So he was a man that traded in Japanese screens for a long time, and he would design homes in a way that he could sell that person that was buying the home design and the building from him a nice location to put up a very large Japanese screen. In this exposition, there was a large Japanese representation of houses and all kinds of artifacts that came from there. Because he was enamored with this style of life, because his parents were, and family were big Universalist Unitarians, so they are already champions of Emerson and Thoreau. When America was living in this way, and we know that intermittently with this story of America living in this way because we came from Europe and this is how we lived in Europe, we have the introduction of modern art, 1907, all of these angles, all of these things that begin to happen, that we finally get the answer of Frank Lloyd Wright to the way we live in America, can have these deep overhangs just like Japanese houses do. And we can have this kind of simplified look. We can live in a home that has lots of light, that shows the beauty of the wood grain, that has built-in furniture, that is highly simplified compared to the way that the Victorian home looked in many cases. So that by the time that we get Frank Lloyd Wright, he has adopted and adapted various key points from this Japanese world, so much so that it became second nature for us to think that this was an appropriate way for us to live, because this is the 1920s bungalow. And it is the way that we live today. built-in furniture, simple space that creates a sanctuary for you, as much light as we possibly can get into the house, recessed lighting, all of these innovations that come from Frank Lloyd Wright's interpretation of what the Japanese world was like. So I hope what I've done is explain these significant points as to what happened at this time, because we're going to move on to modern art next time, and we'll talk about all of those people that are going to redefine the 20th century related to abstract ideas. The aggressive and sweeping political changes that were being manifested brought about lots of changes. The deification of nature was an answer to industrialization and urbanization. Women's roles in society were being redefined, and you saw it in art. Artistic output and daring commentary was encouraged because art became a marketable commodity. All right? So we're